The sun was setting on the horizon, painting the sky with orange and purple tones as Matthew drove his luxury car along the winding streets leading to his mansion. He was exhausted after an intense week of negotiations and endless meetings with potential investors. His shoulders ached from accumulated tension, but the simple idea of finally seeing his son Caleb again made his heart race, bringing a spontaneous smile to his tired face. Caleb was only 2 years old, with black curly hair like his, large expressive eyes like his mother who had passed away during childbirth, a wound that still hadn't completely healed in Matthew's heart. The loneliness of loss had been filled by the unconditional love he felt for his son, his only family now. Matthew adjusted the rearview mirror and observed his own reflection. Well-cut brown hair but disheveled by the wind coming through the window. Deep brown eyes, now tired and marked by fine lines under thick eyebrows. And stubble that betrayed the stress of the trip. The top buttons of his blue dress shirt were open, the tie long stored in the glove compartment. At 35, he had built a business empire with iron determination, but discovered that professional success was empty compared to Caleb's daily little achievements. The first step, the first word, the first smile recognizing him in the morning. "I hope Caleb hasn't given Deborah too much trouble," he thought, visualizing the boy's mischievous smile and his little curls bouncing as he ran through the mansion's corridors. "This was the longest trip I've taken since he was born. I promised myself I would be different, that I would be present, that I would be the father I never had." Matthew drummed his fingers on the steering wheel as the last rays of sun disappeared on the horizon. He thought about Deborah, the 40-year-old nanny who had practically become part of the family. With her maternal ways, grey hair always tied in a bun, and gentle hands that seemed to have the magical power to calm Caleb during his sleepless nights or crying fits. He had hired her right after his son's birth and his wife's death, when he was completely lost in the whirlwind of contradictory emotions, the joy of becoming a father and the devastation of losing his great love. Matthew's tranquility was abruptly interrupted when, turning the last curve of the tree-lined road, he spotted an immense column of black smoke rising like an evil serpent in the twilight sky. His heart instantly accelerated, and an icy chill ran down his spine when his brain processed the direction of the smoke. It was exactly where his house was located. Time seemed to slow down while a sense of primordial dread took over every cell of his body. "No, no, no. Please, no," he muttered, his mouth suddenly dry. He floored the accelerator, his car's engine roaring in response as the tires skidded on the asphalt. Matthew's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white, and his breathing became increasingly shallow and rapid. The world around disappeared. There was only the road ahead and that column of smoke that grew with each second, like a terrible omen. A few meters away, his worst nightmare materialized before his eyes. Several fire trucks were chaotically parked on the large front garden, their red lights frantically spinning and cutting through the dusk that was beginning to fall. Hoses serpentined across the lawn like metallic vipers. The mansion, once imposing with its 3 floors and modern architecture that blended glass and stone, was now partially consumed by furious flames of intense orange that escaped through shattered windows and the partially collapsed roof, licking the night sky with incandescent fingers. Matthew braked abruptly, abandoning the car in the middle of the road with the door open and the engine still running. His feet barely touched the ground as he ran toward the inferno, engulfing his house and possibly the 2 most important people in his life. Caleb, Deborah. He desperately shouted, his voice hoarse and broken with terror, feeling the scorching heat of the flames even from a distance. "My son is in there. My son. Please, someone help me. Tell me you got them out." The desperation in his voice was so palpable that several firefighters turned in his direction. One man tried to hold him, but Matthew broke free with superhuman strength, running a few more meters toward the house before 2 other firefighters managed to intercept him, firmly holding him by the arms as he struggled and shouted his son's name, tears beginning to stream down his face covered with soot carried by the wind. Her firefighter with a severe soot-stained face, who appeared to be the operation commander, approached Matthew while the others held him back. The man had deep wrinkles around his eyes and a scar on his left cheek. He looked exhausted, with dark circles under his eyes and a somber expression that Matthew immediately recognized as the bearer of bad news. It was the same look the doctor had given him years ago when informing him of his wife's death. Matthew's heart seemed to freeze in his chest, turning into a block of ice that weighed a ton. "Are you the owner?" asked the firefighter, his deep voice cutting through the air like a blade. "Yes, I'm Matthew," he replied with a trembling voice, still trying to break free. My 2-year-old son is in there with the babysitter. Please, tell me you got them out." The firefighter exchanged a meaningful look with his colleagues before turning his attention back to Matthew. He placed a heavy hand on his shoulder in a gesture meant to be comforting, but which to Matthew seemed like the final seal of a sentence. "Mr. Matthew, according to information from the neighbors, only the babysitter and the child were in the house when the fire started, about 2 hours ago," the man explained, carefully choosing his words. "We tried to enter several times, but what?" Matthew practically shouted, grabbing the firefighter's uniform tightly. "Please, tell me you found them, please." The firefighter held Matthew's hands, gently removing them from his uniform. His eyes, reddened by smoke and fatigue, were full of a professional compassion that could only mean one thing. "The rescue teams managed to partially enter the structure," the firefighter continued, "but the fire was too intense, fueled by the furniture and chemicals in the pool area. Parts of the house had already collapsed, making searches almost impossible. There was a particular concentration of fire in the west wing, where we were informed the bedrooms were located. Matthew felt his legs weaken and would have fallen if he hadn't been held up. His breathing became labored, as if the air around him had suddenly become thin. "Sir, we did everything we could," said the firefighter, his voice hoarse from smoke and exhaustion, his eyes avoiding direct contact for a moment. "We'll continue searching as soon as it's safe to enter again. But I need to be honest with you. The chances of survival for anyone inside are practically non-existent. The heat reached temperatures that, well, it's unlikely anyone could have withstood it for so long." The words hit Matthew like physical blows, each one taking away a bit more of his ability to stand. The world around him began to spin, and a strange buzzing filled his ears, partially drowning out the sounds of the fire and sirens. Matthew's world completely collapsed with those words. The firefighters holding him felt his body suddenly go limp and helped him sit on the curb. But Matthew couldn't even remain seated. His legs gave way completely, and he fell to his knees on the rough asphalt, an agonizing scream escaping from the depths of his throat. The sound was primitive, visceral, the wail of a mortally wounded animal, the cry of a father who had just lost the only meaning of his existence. "No!" The scream tore through the night, momentarily drowning out even the roar of the flames. "Caleb. My son. It can't be true." Tears flowed freely down his face as he watched, helpless, the voracious flames devour what remained of his house, and with it, his precious Caleb. The boy who still slept with a faded blue teddy bear, who laughed uncontrollably when Matthew threw him up in the air, who had recently learned to say, "I love you, Papa," in that childish voice that melted his heart. All of it, reduced to ashes in a nightmare that would never end. Matthew hugged his own body, rocking back and forth as if trying to comfort the child who was no longer there. His mind, in a desperate effort to deny reality, began creating images of Caleb still alive, perhaps hidden in some corner untouched by the fire, waiting to be rescued, calling for him. "He could be alive," he mumbled between sobs, trying to stand again but without the strength to do so. "He's smart, he might have hidden. Please, keep looking." One of the firefighters knelt beside him, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "We'll continue searching as soon as it's safe, sir. I promise." But Matthew barely heard him. His mind wandered to Deborah, the babysitter who had become almost part of the family over the past 2 years and who was now also gone. The 40-year-old woman, with her maternal manner, her hair always smelling of lavender and that gentle smile that calmed any storm. Caleb adored her, Nana as he called her, unable to pronounce Deborah correctly. She knew all the boy's quirks. She knew he wouldn't sleep without his blue blanket, that he hated broccoli but would eat it if hidden in mashed potatoes, that he was afraid of the dark but brave if the hallway light was left on. Guilt began to grow inside Matthew like a voracious monster, suffocating him from within, compressing his lungs until each breath became painful. If he had cancelled the trip, if he had returned a day earlier, if he had invested in more security equipment, "I should have been here," he muttered between sobs, repeatedly punching the ground until his fists were injured, a pain that was nothing compared to the torment he felt inside. "I should have been with him, protecting him. I promised his mother I would never leave him alone. I failed as a father. I failed Caleb. I failed everyone." A paramedic approached, trying to examine his injured hands, but Matthew pushed him away with a sudden movement. He wanted to feel the physical pain. He deserved to feel it. It was too small a punishment for his monumental failure as a father. The following hours passed like a hazy blur, a succession of fragmented images and distorted sounds that barely penetrated the bubble of pain in which Matthew found himself. Someone placed a blanket over his shoulders, although the heat from the fire was still intense. A cup of water appeared in his hands, but he couldn't drink it. People talked to him, asked questions, but their voices were just unintelligible noises against the roar of the flames that continued to echo in his ears, even when the real fire began to diminish. "So you need medical attention," insisted a paramedic for the third time, trying to examine his bloodied hands. "You're in shock." "I'm not going anywhere," Matthew replied, his voice devoid of any emotion, as if he had already exhausted all his capacity to feel. "If I'm in shock, treat me here." Matthew remained seated on the sidewalk in front of the mansion, watching the firefighters work tirelessly to control the flames that gradually decreased in intensity, slowly revealing the complete destruction they had caused. The facade of the mansion, once majestic, was now unrecognizable. The roof had collapsed in several places, and the exterior walls were charred and partially destroyed. His face was as pale as wax and empty of expression, the red and swollen eyes fixed on the smoking ruins of what was once his home. He didn't blink with normal frequency, as if he feared that by closing his eyes even for a second, he would miss some sign of life coming from the rubble. "You'll need stitches on your hands," commented the paramedic, who was now cleaning his wounds, respecting his wish not to leave. "And you'll probably feel pain all over your body tomorrow." "Good," Matthew replied dryly. "I deserve every bit of it." The paramedics tried again to convince him to go to the hospital to treat the shock and abrasions, arguing that nothing more could be done there, but he vehemently refused. He couldn't leave the site. It was as if a part of him still hoped that miraculously Caleb would be found alive among the rubble, calling for him. The idea of being elsewhere when that happened was unbearable. "What if he wakes up in a strange hospital and I'm not there?" Matthew asked the paramedic with logic distorted by trauma. "He'll be scared. I need to be here when they find him." The paramedic exchanged concerned looks with a nearby police officer, but they didn't insist further. The night sky was now completely black, punctuated only by distant stars indifferent to the tragedy unfolding below them. A pale crescent moon rose on the horizon, weakly illuminating the devastation with its silver light. The night breeze, once refreshing, now carried the acrid smell of burnt wood and melted plastic that Matthew couldn't bear. It was an odor he knew he would never forget. It would forever be imprinted in his memory, a constant reminder of this nightmare night. "Mr. Matthew?" A different firefighter cautiously approached, removing his helmet in a gesture of respect. His face was covered in soot, and small burns were visible on his exposed arms, where the protective uniform didn't completely cover. "We've controlled the fire enough to conduct a preliminary search in some areas of the house." Matthew immediately stood up, hope momentarily shining in his exhausted eyes. "And Chung?" he asked, his voice betraying the anxiety he felt. The firefighter hesitated, carefully choosing his words. "We haven't found bodies yet." He paused, observing Matthew's reaction. "But we also haven't found survivors. Much of the internal structure collapsed, making the search extremely difficult. We'll continue at dawn, when we have more light and the residual heat has decreased." The news should have brought some relief or hope, but the firefighter continued, his tone dropping even lower. "Mr. Matthew, I need you to understand something," he began, placing a hand on Matthew's shoulder. "In high-temperature fires like this one, which reach over 1,000 degrees, it often becomes very difficult to locate." The words hung in the air like toxic smoke. His somber expression said everything his words were trying to soften. Matthew's eyes widened with understanding of what was being said, and he felt as if the ground was disappearing beneath his feet. The possibility that Caleb might have been completely consumed by the fire was so horrifying that his brain refused to process the information. "Are you telling me that my son may have—" Matthew couldn't finish the sentence. The words stuck in his throat like shards of glass. "I'm just explaining why we might not find—" The firefighter also couldn't conclude, making a vague gesture with his hands. "We'll continue searching, of course. Sometimes we find evidence in protected areas of the structure." Matthew felt a new wave of pain course through him, so intense that he had to bend over, hugging his own stomach as if he had taken a physical punch. Not having a body to bury, not being able to say goodbye properly, not knowing for certain. It was an additional torture added to the nightmare he was already living. An involuntary groan escaped his lips, a sound so laden with suffering that the firefighter stepped back, visibly disturbed. Memories flooded his mind in a relentless torrent. Caleb taking his first wobbling steps toward him, little arms outstretched and a toothless smile on his face. Caleb calling him Dada for the first time, the sweetest word he had ever heard. Caleb falling asleep in his arms during a fever, completely trusting that his father would keep him safe. Now, each precious memory was like a knife being slowly twisted in his chest. "How could this happen?" asked Matthew, his voice breaking more to himself than to the firefighter beside him. The house had all possible security systems, fire alarms in every room, automatic sprinklers. "I spent a fortune to ensure it was the safest house in the entire region. That's why we're investigating," the firefighter replied cautiously. "Modern security systems rarely fail this way unless—" "Unless what?" Matthew looked up, suddenly alert. "Unless they were deliberately deactivated or the fire was intentionally set." The firefighter observed Matthew carefully as he said these words. "But it's too early to make any assertions. Our investigation team will analyze it carefully as soon as it's safe to enter." The firefighter's words awakened something in Matthew, a spark of anger amid the ocean of despair. Arson? Someone would have deliberately set fire to his house, knowing his son was inside. The idea was so monstrous that it almost momentarily distracted him from his pain. As the night progressed, forensic technicians arrived in their white vans with specialized equipment to begin investigating the cause of the fire. Matthew watched their methodical movements like a ghost, present only in body, while his mind wandered through a labyrinth of pain and denial. They wore gray uniforms with protective gloves and masks, moving with clinical efficiency around the property perimeter, taking photographs, collecting samples, and conversing in low voices among themselves. One of them, a middle-aged man with dark-framed glasses and a graying mustache, approached Matthew moments later. He removed his gloves and mask before speaking, revealing a face marked by experience and eyes that had witnessed too many tragedies. "Sir, I'm the lead investigator for this incident," he introduced himself with a calm but firm voice. "First, my condolences for what you're going through. I know there are no words that can comfort at this time, but I want you to know we'll do everything to discover exactly what happened here." Matthew merely nodded, unable to formulate a coherent response. The investigator continued, carefully choosing his words. "Preliminary evidence points to a fire origin in the east wing of the mansion, possibly in the kitchen or the adjacent laundry room. The flame propagation pattern suggests that the fire spread very rapidly, which is unusual in residences with modern security systems." Matthew looked up, a spark of attention appearing in his empty eyes. "What does that mean?" "It means we need a more thorough investigation to determine whether it was accidental or—" The investigator made a significant pause. "Or criminal." The word criminal echoed in Matthew's mind like a distant bell, reverberating between the walls of the abyss into which his consciousness had fallen. Could someone have done this deliberately? The idea was inconceivable, so monstrous that his pain-numbed brain could barely process it, but it planted a seed in his mind, a tiny seed that began to germinate in the fertile soil of his despair. "Criminal," repeated Matthew, his voice hoarse from crying, almost unrecognizable to his own ears. The fingers of his injured hands involuntarily contracted. "Are you suggesting that someone might have done this on purpose? That someone entered my house and—" Who would wish harm on an innocent child? Who would do this to my son? The investigator maintained a neutral, professional expression, but his eyes betrayed compassion. Mr. Matthew, I'm not suggesting anything yet. It's too early for conclusions. We're just following protocol and considering all possibilities. Fires of this magnitude with modern security systems are rare. It's our duty to investigate all possible causes. Matthew ran his hands through his hair, now disheveled and dirty with soot. For the first time since he arrived, he felt something beyond the paralyzing pain, an urgency, a need to understand, to know, to find answers. If someone had done this deliberately, if someone had hurt his son. The firefighters finally declared the fire completely under control around midnight, although the structure still smoked at various points like a wounded beast, occasionally expelling grey clouds of smoke into the dark sky. The smell of destruction permeated everything. The air, Matthew's clothes, his skin, his hair. It was as if the disaster itself had become part of him, merging with every fibre of his being. Matthew remained seated in the same place, unable to move, as if rooted to the ground. His empty gaze alternated between the destroyed house and the phone in his hands. Should he call someone? Who could possibly help at this moment? What would he say? How could he transform into words the personal apocalypse he was experiencing? His disoriented mind alternated between absolute denial and the searing pain of acceptance. A moment of clarity made him realize the true extent of his loss. He had not only lost his physical son, but also all the possible futures Caleb could have had. He wouldn't see him grow up, go to school for the first time with his little backpack, learn to ride a bike, graduate, fall in love, build his own life. All the paths that could have opened for his son had been reduced to ashes along with the mansion. I promised I would always be by your side, he whispered to the void, a solitary tear sliding down his exhausted face. I promised your mother I would protect you with my life. And Deborah, always so dedicated and caring with Caleb, her loss also left a void in Matthew's life. She wasn't just an employee. Over the past 2 years, she had become part of the small family they formed. She knew all of Caleb's quirks, his favorite stories, knew how to calm him during storms that frightened him. Matthew remembered how she cried with emotion when Caleb took his first steps, as if he were her own son. She had no close family, he murmured to the police officer who still remained by his side, as if he had just remembered this fact. Just a sister somewhere distant, with whom she rarely spoke. She told me once that Caleb and I were her true family now. The officer nodded silently, not knowing what to say. Matthew continued, his voice choked. Now it will be up to me to notify that sister too. How do you tell someone that their sister died in a fire under my responsibility? How can I even find words when I myself can't breathe? The crowd of onlookers and neighbors that had gathered during the height of the fire had already dispersed, leaving only a few police officers, exhausted firefighters, and Matthew at the desolate scene. The lights from the truck still occasionally flashed, creating ghostly shadows that danced on the charred ruins. The silence of the night was now broken only by the occasional crackling of burned wood, the low murmur of emergency crews, and the distant sound of equipment being stored away. One of the neighbors, an elderly man whom Matthew vaguely recognized, had tried to offer his house for Matthew to rest, but Matthew refused. He couldn't stay within safe walls while his son was. He couldn't even complete the thought. Matthew felt completely alone in the world, a castaway in an endless ocean of pain, with no coast in sight, no lifeboat, no hope of rescue. The mansion, once a gleaming symbol of his success and prosperity, now stood as a macabre monument to his greatest loss. The blackened walls, broken windows, partially collapsed roof, everything seemed to mock him and his inability to protect what he loved most. If only I had cancelled the trip, he thought, torturing himself with what could have been. If only I had returned yesterday as I initially planned. A young police officer, probably in his first year of service, judging by his beardless face and impeccable uniform, a stark contrast to the chaos around, hesitantly approached Matthew. He carried a notepad and seemed uncomfortable with the task assigned to him. "Sir, you shouldn't be here alone," said the officer, his voice betraying insecurity in the face of the magnitude of the tragedy he was witnessing. "Is there somewhere you can go tonight? Any family or friend you could call?" Matthew was about to respond that he wasn't going anywhere when he noticed movement in the nearby shadows, near a group of bushes that had miraculously escaped the fire. His senses, dulled by trauma, slowly registered that someone was watching them. A small, thin figure slowly emerged from the darkness, approaching with cautious steps that resembled an unsure wild animal debating whether to trust or flee. It was a girl no more than 10 years old, with worn and dirty clothes that hung loosely on her thin body. Her black, tangled hair framed a small, angular face that seemed not to have seen proper food in days. Her face was smudged with soot and marked by tracks of dried tears, but her dark eyes, deep and knowing in a way no child should be, shone with an intensity that immediately captured Matthew's attention. Something in the girl's gaze, a mixture of fear, determination, and something else he couldn't identify, made Matthew instinctively stand up. The girl stopped a few steps away, assessing the situation, observing him with an expression that seemed much older than her few years, as if she had already seen too much of the dark side of life. "Are you the owner of this house?" she finally asked, her voice surprisingly firm for someone so young, just a slight tremor on the last syllable. "Are you the father of the little boy?" Matthew nodded slowly, unable to formulate words. His throat seemed closed, blocked by the sudden curiosity that had momentarily pierced the bubble of despair surrounding him. The officer turned, noticing the girl for the first time, and took a step toward her with the evident intention of removing her from the scene. "Hey, little one, you can't be here," said the officer, extending his hand to move her away. "This is a restricted area, wait," Matthew interrupted, raising his hand to stop the officer. His voice, which moments before could barely emit coherent sounds, now had an urgency that surprised even himself. "Let her speak." The officer hesitated, looking from Matthew to the girl, but eventually took a step back, still vigilant. Matthew slowly knelt down, coming to the child's eye level. Up close he could see the freckles scattered across her delicate nose, the fingernails bitten to the quick, the small cuts and bruises on her arms and legs that spoke of a hard life on the streets. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice gentle despite the storm raging inside him. "Sophie," she replied simply, offering no surname. Her eyes never left Matthew's, as if she were assessing whether he was trustworthy. "Sophie," repeated Matthew, feeling the name as something tangible, a small anchor in reality. "You said you know something about what happened here, about my son." The girl quickly looked around, as if checking if they were being watched. She took another step forward, coming so close that Matthew could smell the smoke embedded in her clothes, mixed with the characteristic odor of someone living on the streets. There was a contained ferocity in her movements, like a wild animal that has learned to survive on its own. "I saw," she whispered, her hot breath against Matthew's face. "I was there, in those bushes. I come here sometimes to sleep when it rains. It's safe and nobody kicks me out." Matthew's heart raced, adrenaline suddenly coursing through his veins. A witness, someone who saw what happened? His mind, moments before numbed by pain, was now perfectly alert, desperately clinging to this small possibility. "What did you see, Sophie? Please tell me," he begged, resisting the urge to grab the girl by the shoulders. Sophie briefly looked at the police officer, who had moved away just enough to give them privacy, but still close enough to intervene if necessary. Then she turned her dark, penetrating eyes to Matthew. There was an ancient wisdom in that gaze, as if that child had lived several lives before this one. When she spoke, her words fell like stones in a calm lake, creating waves that would spread far beyond that moment. "Sir, I know who did this, and your son is alive." The central square was bustling with activity under the morning sun. Street vendors set up their colorful stalls. The aroma of fresh coffee and freshly baked bread mingled in the air, while hurried people crossed in all directions, absorbed in their own worlds. Sitting on a worn wooden bench, Matthew kept his eyes fixed on little Sophie, who was voraciously chewing the sandwich he had bought for her. Her clothes, the same from the night before, seemed even more worn in the daylight. Matthew had spent the night in a nearby hotel, unable to sleep, his mind tormented by the girl's words. The deep dark circles and stubble gave him the appearance of a man 10 years older. His hands, bandaged from injuries caused when he punched the asphalt, trembled slightly as he waited for Sophie to finish eating. The promise that his son might be alive was the only thing preventing him from completely falling apart. "You didn't believe me last night, did you?" "I saw it in your eyes," said Sophie, swallowing the last piece of sandwich and wiping the crumbs from her mouth with her torn sleeve. "Adults never believe children, especially children like me." The buzz of the square grew around them, but Matthew barely noticed. After Sophie's shocking revelation the night before, the police officer had tried to dismiss her words as fantasies of a street child, but something in the girl's steady gaze had prevented Matthew from ignoring her. He had convinced the officer to let him talk to Sophie, promising to take her to the authorities afterward. Now, in this busy square, away from the smoking ruins of his house, Matthew tried to process what that small girl was about to reveal. Hope and despair fought within him with equal strength, the fear of allowing himself to believe his son might be alive, only to have that hope crushed again. "Sophie, I need you to tell me exactly what you saw," Matthew asked, leaning forward, his voice controlled despite the emotional storm raging inside him. "I'm not doubting you, but understand that what you're saying, this would change everything." Sophie took a sip from the juice box Matthew had bought, her dark eyes never leaving his, as if continually assessing whether she could trust this adult. There was a maturity in that child that spoke of a life too hard for her age. Finally, seeming to make a decision, she straightened her shoulders and began to speak, her voice low but surprisingly firm. "I was sleeping in those bushes near your house. I do that sometimes when it rains or gets too cold. Nobody chases me away from there," she explained, shrugging as if apologizing. "Yesterday, very early, even before sunrise, I saw your babysitter, that tall woman with gray hair, leaving through the back door. She was carrying a large suitcase and had your son in her arms, sleeping. I thought it was strange, but it's not my business what people do, you know? I've lived on the streets long enough to know it's better not to get involved in other people's affairs." The revelation hit Matthew like lightning, sending an electric current throughout his body. Deborah leaving with Caleb before the fire. It wasn't possible. Deborah, who had practically helped raise Caleb since his birth, who knew all his quirks, who loved him almost like a son. The idea was so absurd, so unthinkable, that his mind struggled to accept it as a possibility. And yet there was a witness. "Are you absolutely sure it was Deborah?" "And my son?" asked Matthew, his heart hammering against his chest so hard it seemed about to break his ribs. "Sophie, you need to be certain about this. There can be no mistake." Sophie nodded vigorously, momentary irritation crossing her childish features at having her word questioned. She settled on the bench, now completely engaged in her narrative, as if reliving the scene as she spoke. Her small, dirty fingers nervously played with the frayed edge of her shirt as she continued her account. "I know your nanny by sight. She used to give me food sometimes when she saw me in the bushes, but she asked me not to tell anyone I was staying there," revealed Sophie, a shadow passing over her face. That day, she seemed different, agitated, looking over her shoulder all the time. She put the boy in the back seat of a car I had never seen before, not the car she normally uses. Then she went back inside the house. I got curious and moved closer. Through the kitchen window, I saw her pouring some liquid on the floor. It smelled strong, like those products people use for cleaning. She was talking to herself, saying strange things. Matthew's stomach turned with the description, and he had to breathe deeply several times to contain the nausea rising in his throat. The image of Deborah deliberately spreading fuel throughout the house, his house, the house where his son slept every night, was so grotesque, so completely irreconcilable with the gentle and dedicated woman he knew, that his mind almost refused to process it. And yet something fit. The investigator had mentioned that the fire spread too quickly for an accidental fire, that the security system seemed to have been deliberately disabled. What was she saying, Sophie? Could you hear? Asked Matthew, his voice almost unrecognizable to his own ears, deep and rough from tension and the effort to maintain composure. Sophie looked around the square, as if afraid of being overheard, despite the noise of the crowd that served as a sound curtain around them. Her eyes, already large and expressive, seemed even bigger in her small, thin face. Leaning closer to Matthew, she lowered her voice to almost a whisper. She was saying she would finally have her own child, that you two would never be found again, that she would start a new life, reported Sophie, her eyes never leaving Matthew's. She talked about new documents she got, about money she had saved. Your money, I think. She laughed in a strange way, didn't seem like the same person. Then she went out again, got in the car and waited. About 20 minutes later, I saw smoke starting to come out of the house. That's when she started the car and drove away, with your son still sleeping in the back seat. Matthew felt the air escape from his lungs, as if he had been punched. The betrayal was so deep, so complete, that it bordered on the unimaginable. Deborah, who for 2 years had shared his table, who knew his schedules, who had unrestricted access to his house, his bank account, his life. Deborah, who had held Caleb in his first moments of life, who had comforted him during colic and nightmares, who knew exactly how to make him sleep when nothing else worked. This same Deborah had coldly planned to steal not only his money, but his only child, the only family he had left, and then burn down his house, presumably to destroy any evidence and make him believe they were both dead. Why, Sophie? Why would she do something like this? Asked Matthew, more to himself than to the girl, his hands gripping the bench so tightly that his knuckles turned white under the bandages. Sophie hesitated, shuffling her feet that barely touched the ground. She seemed to be deciding whether to share one more piece of information. Finally, with a sigh that seemed too old for her few years, she looked directly into Matthew's eyes. I heard her talking to a woman at the market months ago, revealed Sophie, her voice now almost inaudible. I didn't pay much attention at the time, but she was saying she couldn't have children. That she wanted to badly, but doctors said it was impossible. She was crying. The other woman suggested adoption, but Deborah said it wasn't the same thing, that she wanted a baby of her own from the beginning. She said that sometimes she looked at your son and thought what it would be like if he were hers, that you two could simply disappear and no one would ever know. The final revelation fell upon Matthew like an avalanche, burying him under the weight of the truth. Deborah, consumed by an obsessive desire for a child she biologically couldn't have, had found in Caleb the object of her unhealthy fixation. She had probably planned everything for months, waiting for the perfect opportunity, his business trip, to execute her monstrous plan. The initial shock began to give way to a cold and calculating fury, a type of anger he had never experienced before. Did you tell anyone about this, Sophie? The police? The firefighters? Asked Matthew, sudden urgency in his voice as he checked the time. Every minute that passed was another minute Deborah had to escape, to potentially cross borders with his son. Sophie shook her head negatively, a flash of fear crossing her face. She flinched slightly, as if expecting to be scolded, a conditioned reflex from years of surviving on the streets where adults were rarely sources of comfort or protection. I tried to talk to a policeman when I saw the fire, but he drove me away, said street children only cause problems, she explained, a hint of bitterness in her young voice. No one believes people like me, Mr. Matthew. We're invisible until someone needs to blame us for something. The injustice of it hit Matthew almost as strongly as Deborah's betrayal. This child, who could be the only witness to the heinous crime committed against his family, had been discarded simply because of her social status. How many times had he himself passed by children like Sophie without really seeing them? The anger inside him now had two targets, Deborah and a system that allowed children like Sophie to live on the margins, invisible and ignored. I'm going to the police right now, Matthew decided, rising abruptly. Determination had replaced despair on his face, giving him an energy that contrasted strongly with his exhausted appearance. You're coming with me, Sophie. I'll make sure they hear every word you have to say. Sophie didn't move from the bench, her eyes suddenly cautious. There was distrust in her gaze, the kind that only develops after repeated disappointments. She hugged herself, as if trying to protect her body. They'll send me to some shelter, or worse, return me to people who don't care about me, she said, fear evident in her trembling voice. I've been through this before. I prefer the streets. Matthew stopped, truly looking at Sophie perhaps for the first time. He saw beyond the dirt and torn clothes, beyond the premature hardness in her eyes. He saw just a frightened child who, despite everything, had chosen to get involved to help a stranger, risking her own precarious safety in the process. The decision he made next wasn't planned. It emerged from a place of pure instinct, from a primal need to protect that had been violently reactivated by the possibility that his son might still be alive. You're right, Sophie. The police will take time, follow protocols, maybe even prevent me from looking for Caleb while they investigate your story, concluded Matthew, a new resolution rising within him. I'll do this alone. I'll find my son and confront Deborah personally. And I want you to come with me. You're the only witness, the only one who can help me find them before they disappear forever. The surprise on Sophie's face was genuine, a flash of hope crossing her cautious features before she could hide it. There was something in her expression suggesting that no one had really needed her before, that no one had valued what she had to offer. Slowly, she nodded, a silent alliance forming between the desperate businessman and the street girl. "Where do we start?" she asked, rising from the bench with renewed determination, her small shoulders straightening as if ready to carry the weight of this mission. The relentless afternoon sun reflected off the windows of buildings as Matthew and Sophie hurried through the busy streets of the commercial district. The girl's watchful eyes scanned every stall, every document shop, every improvised office offering advisory services, places she knew well from her life on the streets, where identities could be purchased for the right price. Matthew had traded his expensive suit for simpler clothes to avoid drawing attention, jeans, dark t-shirt, and a cap that partially shadowed his face. The hours since Sophie's revelation in the square had been a whirlwind of activity. First, they quickly returned to the hotel where Matthew was staying to gather resources, cash, his notebook, and some essential items. He no longer trusted the authorities after Sophie's account of how she was ignored, and feared that any bureaucratic delay could mean losing Caleb forever. Adrenaline kept Matthew awake despite his sleepless night, and determination burned in his eyes as he followed the small guide through the entrails of the city he'd never imagined knowing. Deborah would need new documents for herself and Caleb. "Passports, certificates, everything," Sophie explained, leading him through a narrow alley. "I know a place where people usually go when they need to disappear. If we're lucky, someone there might have information about her." The establishment Sophie led him to looked like a simple stationery store from the front, but from the looks of recognition the girl received upon entering, Matthew realized there was much more happening there. The owner, a fat man with a thin mustache, visibly paled at seeing Sophie accompanied by a determined-looking adult. Matthew went straight to the point, placing a photo of Deborah on the counter, along with a significant amount of money. He didn't mention kidnapping or fire, just said he needed to find this woman urgently for family matters. The man hesitated, looking nervously at the back door, until Sophie said something in a low voice that Matthew couldn't hear. Whatever information was shared, it had an immediate effect. With trembling hands, the man took the photo, examined it carefully, and then nodded. "She was here 3 days ago, before the fire," confirmed the man, lowering his voice. "Ordered a complete package: passports, certificates, driver's licenses, premium work with system implementation, paid double to have everything ready in 48 hours. Where was she planning to go? Did she say anything?" asked Matthew, leaning over the counter, his voice a mixture of urgency and veiled threat. "I need to find her before it's too late." After some further financial negotiations, the man revealed that Deborah had mentioned plans to catch an international flight the next morning. The destination was unclear, but she had requested that the documents work especially well for border crossings without raising suspicion. Matthew's heart raced. There was still time, but very little. Quickly leaving the stationery store, he and Sophie headed to the next point of investigation, a travel agency indicated by the forger where Deborah might have purchased tickets. Time was working against them, each minute an hourglass emptying the chances of finding Caleb. On the way, Matthew used his phone to call contacts who could discreetly help. A private detective he had previously hired for business matters, a friend who worked in airport administration. The network was beginning to form, but fear corroded his stomach like acid. "She's smart, wouldn't use her own credit card or anything that could be traced," reflected Matthew, guiding Sophie through a busy square. "But she must have left some trail, some pattern we can follow." The travel agency proved to be a dead end, but the private detective returned the call with crucial information. He had located the car Sophie had described, abandoned in a long-term parking lot near the airport. Deborah had probably taken a taxi or rideshare app from there. The lead was tenuous, but it was all they had. Matthew and Sophie crossed the city in a taxi, the silence between them loaded with anxiety and hope. Upon reaching the parking lot, Matthew confirmed that the vehicle matched exactly the description provided by Sophie. A black sedan, discreet, with a small scratch on the passenger door. There was nothing of value inside, but under the passenger seat Sophie found a crumpled receipt, a receipt from a hotel near the airport, dated the previous day. She must be waiting for the flight there, concluded Matthew, his heart thundering in his chest, hidden until the last moment when it would be safer to go to the airport. The Imperial Hotel was a mid-range establishment, perfect for someone seeking a balance between comfort and discretion without drawing attention. Located just 15 minutes from the airport, it offered shuttle service every hour, ideal for a fugitive with a child. Matthew parked across the street, observing the main entrance while formulating a plan. He couldn't simply barge in and cause a scene. If Deborah saw him coming, she might flee with Caleb, or worse, use the boy as a shield. Sophie, with her natural ability to go unnoticed, offered to go in first and confirm if they were really there. Matthew was reluctant to involve the girl even more, but she insisted it was the best option. No one paid attention to poor children, and she could circulate through the lobby without raising suspicion. With clear instructions not to approach Deborah if she saw her, just confirm her presence and return immediately, Sophie crossed the street toward the hotel. "Be careful, Sophie," whispered Matthew, watching the small figure disappear through the revolving doors. "If something happens to you too, I'll never forgive myself." The 20 minutes that followed were the longest of Matthew's life. Sitting in the car, he alternated between nervously drumming on the steering wheel and checking his watch every 30 seconds. When he finally spotted Sophie calmly leaving through the hotel's side door, he almost let out an audible sigh of relief. The girl didn't run, maintaining a casual appearance as she crossed the street. As soon as she got into the car, her normally impassive face opened into a small smile of triumph. "Room 217, she reported, her eyes shining with contained excitement. "I saw Deborah in the hotel restaurant with her son. He's fine, eating ice cream. She seems nervous, checking her watch all the time." There are 2 large suitcases next to their table. The plan formed quickly. Matthew called his friend at the airport, confirming that there was indeed a reservation under the name Lucia Mendez, the name the forger had mentioned, on an international flight departing the next morning. The confirmation ignited an even greater urgency within him. He couldn't wait until dawn. He needed to recover Caleb now. With Sophie by his side, Matthew developed a simple but effective strategy. The girl would enter first, discreetly, and stay in the lobby as a lookout, ready to alert him by phone if Deborah tried to leave with Caleb. Matthew would enter 5 minutes later, go directly to the room using the emergency stairs to avoid being seen, and wait. When Deborah returned with Caleb, he would confront her in the room, away from witnesses who might interfere, before he could recover his son. What if she doesn't return to the room? What if she decides to run right now? Asked Sophie, concern evident on her young but experienced face. She seemed ready to leave at any moment. The confrontation occurred exactly as Matthew had planned, but nothing could have prepared him for the whirlwind of emotions that hit him when the door to the room opened and he saw Caleb entering hand in hand with Deborah. The boy, oblivious to the drama unfolding, smiled with traces of ice cream around his mouth. He looked happy, healthy, and for a surreal moment, Matthew wondered if he was doing the right thing by interrupting this seemingly normal scene. Then Caleb saw him, the instant recognition followed by the joyful cry of "Papa," as the boy released Deborah's hand and ran toward him, dispelled any doubt. Matthew fell to his knees, embracing his son tightly while uncontrollable tears rolled down his face. Deborah stood paralyzed at the door, blood draining from her face, an expression of absolute shock quickly replaced by something more calculating as her eyes darted around the room, assessing escape routes. "How did you find me?" asked Deborah, her trembling voice betraying the panic behind the calm she tried to project. "You should be dead. I mean, you should think we were dead." Still holding Caleb firmly against his chest with one arm, Matthew stood up and faced the woman who had betrayed his trust in the most cruel way possible. The anger he had felt when hearing Sophie's account was nothing compared to what he experienced now, seeing Deborah in the flesh, caught in the act of her heinous crime. She had set fire to his house, stolen his son, left him to believe that the child he loved most in the world was dead, all for a sick obsession. Caleb, sensing the tension in the air, clung tighter to his father, hiding his face in his shoulder. This small gesture of trust and dependence caused something to break inside Matthew. It wasn't just about punishing Deborah now. It was about protecting his son from additional trauma this situation could cause. "I had a witness, Deborah," he responded, keeping his voice controlled despite the internal storm. "Someone saw you leaving the house with Caleb before the fire, saw you spreading fuel, heard your plans." Deborah initially denied it, as Matthew expected. She tried to construct an elaborate narrative about having saved Caleb from the fire, about how she planned to contact him once they were safe, claiming to fear for their lives due to supposed threats Matthew had received. But her story had obvious flaws, and when Matthew mentioned specific details that only someone who witnessed her preparations could know, the fake documents, the money stolen from his accounts, the exact words she had muttered to herself while preparing the fire, her performance crumbled. Deborah's face contorted, transforming into something unrecognizable, a mask of rage and desperation that revealed the true person behind the maternal facade she had maintained for years. "You never valued him like I did," she shouted, abandoning pretenses. "Always busy, always traveling, leaving him with me. I am more of a mother to him than that woman who died ever was. He deserves someone who puts his needs first, someone who is willing to sacrifice everything for him." The confession came in an uncontrollable torrent, as if a dam had broken. Deborah spoke about years of infertility, about how she had observed other women with their children, feeling a corrosive envy that eventually transformed into something darker. She spoke about how initially she had accepted the job with Matthew only as a means of support, but as she became attached to Caleb, she began to fantasize that he was her son. The fantasy grew, fueled by every moment she cared for him alone, every night she put him to bed, every morning when she was the first person he saw. Matthew listened in horrified silence, keeping Caleb protected in his arms, the boy now asleep, exhausted by the emotional confusion and the day's activities. "I planned for months," Deborah finally admitted, all pretense abandoned. "Every detail, every contingency. The fire was perfect. It started exactly where it should, spread exactly as I planned. You would never find me. Tomorrow we would be far away, starting a new life, just me and my son." The sound of footsteps in the hallway interrupted Deborah's confession. The woman's expression changed instantly, the apparent remorse replaced by cold determination. Her eyes darted to the door, then to the window, assessing options. Matthew realized her intentions a second before she acted. With Caleb secure in one arm, he extended the other just as Deborah made a desperate move toward the door. The collision was brief but decisive, and Deborah stumbled backward, knocking over a lamp that shattered on the floor. The noise drew immediate attention. The room door burst open, revealing two uniformed police officers with weapons drawn. Matthew's friend at the airport had done more than check flight reservations. He had alerted authorities about a possible child abduction. "Police, nobody move," shouted the first officer, quickly assessing the situation while his partner entered the room. "Sir, step back slowly with the child." Deborah took advantage of the moment of confusion to make her move. With a quick, desperate motion, she pushed the second officer against the wall and darted toward the open door. Her escape lasted only 3 steps down the hallway before the first officer caught up with her, taking her down with a precise movement. The sound of handcuffs closing echoed in the corridor, overlapping with Deborah's furious screams, and then defeated sobs as she was restrained. Matthew remained inside the room, protecting Caleb's eyes and ears, who had awakened frightened by the noise. Sophie appeared at the door, breathless from having run up the stairs upon hearing the commotion, and her gaze met Matthew's above the chaos. No words were needed to express what both felt: relief, gratitude, and a connection forged through the fire of adversity. "Everything's okay now, Caleb," Matthew whispered in his son's ear, gently cradling him as silent tears of relief and gratitude dampened his curly hair. "Daddy's here, and I'll never let anything bad happen to you again. I promise." The imposing courtroom was packed. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows, projecting geometric patterns on the polished floor. Matthew waited, seated in the first row, his hands slightly trembling as he adjusted his tie. To his right, Sophie observed everything with attentive eyes, wearing a simple but elegant dress that had replaced her former tattered clothes. To his left, the social worker held Caleb, who played absent-mindedly with a small toy car, oblivious to the importance of the moment. Months had passed since the rescue at the hotel, months of testimonies, evidence, and legal battles. Today, finally, the verdict would be announced. "All rise for the judge," announced the officer, and the entire room rose in a synchronized movement. Deborah, seated at the defense table, kept her head down, her body visibly thinner since her arrest. When she briefly raised her gaze, Matthew noticed that her eyes, once gentle and warm, now seemed empty, like windows to an abandoned house. It was difficult to reconcile this worn figure with the woman who had cared for his son for years, who had gained his complete trust, and who had then betrayed all that with such cruelty. "Nervous?" whispered Sophie, her small hand finding Matthew's in a surprisingly comforting gesture. "Don't worry, she'll pay for what she did. I saw everything, remember? My testimony was clear." The judge, an elderly man with a severe expression, adjusted his glasses while leafing through the final documents. The silence in the room was so dense that Matthew could hear his own breathing. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the judge raised his eyes and began to speak, his firm voice echoing off the walls. "This court finds the defendant Deborah guilty of all charges: kidnapping of a minor, attempted murder, forgery of documents, theft, and arson." A collective murmur ran through the room, quickly silenced by the judge's gavel. Matthew closed his eyes for a moment, a complex mixture of emotions running through his veins. Not joy, not exactly satisfaction, perhaps just the relief of closure. "The defendant is sentenced to 20 years in prison, with no possibility of parole for the first 15, continued the judge, his voice now carrying the weight of the sentence. "Additionally, she is prohibited from any contact with the victim, Caleb, or his family in perpetuity." When the judge struck the gavel for the last time, sealing Deborah's fate, she finally raised her gaze, her eyes meeting Matthew's. There was no hatred there nor regret, just a deep, resigned sadness. As the guards escorted her out, she turned one last time, her gaze now fixed on Caleb. For an instant, her mask crumbled, revealing the obsessive and distorted love that had brought her to this point. Then, the doors closed, and Deborah disappeared from their lives forever. Months later, Matthew drove down a tree-lined road away from the bustle of the city. The new house, much smaller and cozier than the old mansion, appeared before him. A two-story building with a spacious garden and a swing hanging from the front tree. It wasn't as luxurious as his former residence, but it was safe, welcoming, and most importantly, free from the ghosts of the past. "Are we here?" asked Sophie from the back seat, leaning forward to look out the window. Her hair, now well cut and shiny, framed a face that gained healthy colors each day. "Yes, we're home," Matthew replied, parking the car. "Do you like what you see, Sophie?" Beside her, Caleb clapped enthusiastically, more talkative and expressive than ever. New house," he chanted, his innocence recovered after months of child therapy. The three walked together to the entrance. Matthew carried Caleb with one arm, while his other hand firmly held Sophie's. On the porch, a folder of documents awaited, the adoption papers finally approved. After meticulous investigations into Sophie's past, interviews and psychological evaluations, the judge had formalized what their hearts already knew. They were a family. "You know, Sophie," said Matthew as he opened the door to the new house, "if it weren't for you, for your courage and determination, I would have lost Caleb forever. I can never thank you enough." Sophie smiled, still a bit uncomfortable with direct praise, a remnant of her life on the streets where vulnerability was weakness. "I just did what anyone would do," she murmured, though they both knew that wasn't true. The house inside was bright and welcoming. Simple but comfortable furniture, freshly painted walls, and in the living room 3 photo frames on the fireplace, Caleb as a baby in his biological mother's arms, Sophie on her first day of school, a completely new experience for her, and the 3 of them together on the day the adoption process began. That night, after a home-cooked dinner prepared by the 3, with Sophie surprisingly skilled in the kitchen and Caleb making more mess than helping, Matthew watched the children playing in the living room. Sophie patiently taught Caleb how to build a tower of blocks, her natural gentleness flourishing, now that she had found safety and acceptance. Bedtime, little ones, announced Matthew, seeing Caleb rub his eyes with sleep. In the new routine they had established, Matthew would put Caleb to bed first, reading him a story until he fell asleep. Then it was Sophie's turn, who, despite protesting that she was too grown up for bedtime stories, always asked for just one more chapter. Later, sitting on the porch under the starry sky, Matthew reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought him there. From the absolute devastation of finding his house in flames, believing he had lost everything, to this moment of deep peace with a rebuilt family. Different, unexpected, but genuine and strong. The pain would never completely disappear. Deborah's betrayal, the trauma of the fire, the nights when Caleb still woke up crying. But now there was also joy, growth, and above all, hope. A new family, forged not by blood but by love and shared resilience. If Matthew and Sophie's story moved you, don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment where you're from. And don't go anywhere. The next story is already appearing on the screen, made especially for you. See you soon.